Hey everybody, let's go on and jump into the third section of our course, the final section of the first week, and that is looking at culture and history. And you've learned about culture, the definition of culture in the first section, but we're going to dig into what it really means and what it looks like right now. And so as you're moving through this section, you're going to constantly see that culture is everywhere and it shapes our society. We often also are operating within cultural guidelines and we don't even realize it because, as I mentioned before, and I talk about in the reading and lecture notes, culture is often best. Culture is best when it's invisible, in that we are just following along to cultural rules and norms, and we don't even realize it because it's so much embedded within the society that we're living in. And one of my favorite examples is of culture is an activity you're going to do later in the semester, or later in the month. And in that activity, you're going to go through a scenario where you go to a fast food restaurant. And just thinking about the drive to the fast food restaurant, how you're going to drive in certain lanes and you know what the stop signs mean and the stop lights. When you pull into the parking lot, you know that those white lines that are drawn in the parking lot are for you to put your car. When you go into the fast food restaurant, there's kind of a script and a rhythm to it in terms of you order at the counter in this restaurant, whereas in other restaurants, you wait to be seated. You kind of have a general idea of what the menu is going to look like. There is a certain script between you and the employee that's taking your order. Everybody that cooking your meals has very much defined roles, and this is all part of our culture because culture is these shared values, beliefs, rules, and objects that guide our lives, and it's shared, but we often are operating within it and don't even know it. And within culture, there's both non-material and material culture, and non-material are going to be things like customs, symbols, patterns of behavior. That's all non-material culture. For example, that the example I just gave with fast food restaurants, there's a lot of behavioral patterns that are examples of non-material culture. Whereas material culture are actual physical things, things that either you can learn about a society from or help shape a society. And you can see that, especially let's look at art. Art tells you a lot about culture because art is often a reflection of culture at a given point in time. If you've ever been to an art museum, you're going to look at a piece and read about the artist who created it, the time frame in which they operated, their influences, and what that's teaching you about is the culture that shaped them, the culture that informed their art, and how they were reflecting that back on this tapestry. And so art tells us a lot about that. I in the reading notes, I encourage you to read those. I talk a lot about architecture. I love architecture, and I love when you travel how much architecture teaches you about the history, the time in which these buildings were built. It teaches you about the influential figures and the influencers that led to this architectural style. You can learn so much about a city and its culture from its architecture, and that's an example of material culture at work. You're going to notice in the reading and in the lecture notes, talk about too how non-material culture and material culture often reflect each other, in that material culture, like for example, a car shapes so much of American life, and in terms of there's a lot of patterns of behavior and skill sets that come with the fact that we are a car reliant society. And there's also a lot materially in our society that reflects the reality that we are a car dependent country. Think about how we design our cities around cars. Whether it be the roadways, whether it be the stoplights, all that kind of stuff is reflecting that cars are an integral part of our culture. But also for non-material culture, most of you probably have a driver's license or have learned to drive. That's because in response to the material element of cars and automobiles and how it's becoming more embedded in our culture, you then need to develop the skill set in order to operate within it. And that's where you can kind of see the interchange between material and non-material culture. Now, in the second piece of this section, we're looking a lot how culture can vary across countries, across societies. However, what you're going to notice is this is tending to becoming less true, and that's largely because of globalization. The ninth section of this course, which is next to last, we're going to talk in depth about globalization and about how globalization is actually leading to more cultures looking like each other, being more homogenous. And so you're seeing less cultural differences. Always my favorite example of this, and I'll revisit it a lot, is how we can see American culture encroaching on other cultures. And this is best seen through fast food. When I was traveling in Greece and Italy last year, I like to take pictures of a McDonald's in every city we went to, because McDonald's very much is a symbol of American culture. However, it is becoming more widespread. And what you're seeing is, if you went to a McDonald's in Rome, you can have the same dining experience that you have in Newport News, Virginia at a McDonald's. And so that cultural experience no longer is unique now in Rome in that specific meal, because the culture in that restaurant looks the same as the culture that exists in the US. And that's where you can kind of see globalization leading to cultures being more similar. However, it's caused a lot of issues as well. And I want you to really dig in to what we mean by cultural relativism and ethnocentrism. And that's, first off, cultural relativism is the idea that in order to actually understand beliefs and practices in some kind of society, you must understand the context of the culture. And this can be difficult. And the way to think about this is, if you've ever been to a different country, maybe there were certain things that made you uncomfortable because it took you out of your daily rhythm that you have in the US. What that probably was a difference in culture that you were then being exposed to, because we become comfortable in our own culture. Once again, culture is invisible. It largely guides our everyday behaviors. So we often notice culture when we're in a different one. Now, being a cultural relativist means that you are respectful of other cultures when you're studying them. So if you're operating from a cultural relativist position, when you see differences between your own culture and another culture, rather than judging it as being lesser than or worse or making you feel uncomfortable, a cultural relativist is try to understand, okay, well, why is this element of culture different? What has led to that? And that can be difficult, especially when we see a lot of brutal practices that are done in different cultures. That can be very, very difficult to be a cultural relativist at that point. But it's important when studying culture, always noting that different doesn't always mean worse. It doesn't mean worse off, because when you take that perspective, that's when you are being ethnocentric. And that is very dangerous, in our world, I think, very dangerous in terms of when you are saying, hey, my culture is superior and any other culture that operates differently is lesser than. And we often reinforce this a lot because we become comfortable on our own culture. We do different practices and rituals that help, reinforce our allegiance to our culture. So like when we do the Pledge of Allegiance in K-12 education, that is a ritual that is largely influencing individuals to become more attached to U.S. culture. However, when we begin to think that our culture is superior, and we begin exposed to cultural differences, that's when we become resentful of others. Like a lot of resentment toward immigrants is largely based on an ethnocentric view. When you say, hey, you're different than me, you come from a different background, so I see you as lesser than. And that's really, really dangerous. But often these ethnocentric views we have are really misguided and they don't exist. The data doesn't align with it. An example I always give for this is the War on Christmas example. You're going to hear a lot of how, Christmas is being celebrated less. We're losing Christmas holidays because of other cultures moving in and bringing in their own winter holidays or their own religious holidays in the winter. When in reality, most Americans, 9 out of 10 Americans, still celebrate Christmas. Christmas is largely widely celebrated. This idea that we're losing Christmas is a myth, and it doesn't align in the data. However, that's where if you were taking a cultural relativist position and somebody celebrates a different holiday instead of Christmas, you should try to learn why. What are the religious backgrounds, maybe what are the cultural backgrounds that led to the creation of that holiday and led to individuals celebrating it, and how do they celebrate it differently? That's being a cultural relativist, wanting to learn more about other cultures rather than judging it as lesser than. And so make sure you know those terms, because I am going to ask you about that on the first quiz. And I want you to get practice of that, especially for those of you that will be traveling abroad and seeing different cultures soon. Okay, I'll pick up the second video in just a second.